Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. If this is your first visit, my name is Marla and I am the owner and creator of From Rust to Roses Vintage. And this week's video is all about preparing for the holidays. I love this time of year because my favorite holidays are Halloween, Thanksgiving, and Christmas. If you feel the same way, stick around and see what I've made to celebrate these days. I've been in California for the past 2 weeks, and every morning I've had the pleasure of taking this young man on a walk. As we were walking the other day, I spotted these beautiful leaves on the ground, and I thought to myself, is there some way I can incorporate these into some beautiful home decor? So the result of my early morning walk is Project 1. I started out with this large panel made up of thinner boards. I believe it came from Hobby Lobby, but I thrifted it from the Goodwill. And no one had ever done anything to it, so it was perfect for upcycling. I cleaned it off, and then I got out my antiquing glaze by Fusion. I wanted to make the wood darker, and I used the antiquing glaze as sort of a stain. I had a large decoupage paper that I had in mind for this, and so as you'll watch, you'll see that I don't put the stain on the entire board, but I do cover up the ends and enough of the sides that what shows from outside the decoupage paper will be dark. Now, as I was putting this stain on the wood, I noticed that it had sort of a yellowy color, similar to the leaves, and so I didn't think that that was going to work out. I didn't think my leaves would show up very much if I used this as a base color. So as you'll see, once I got this on there, I then went over it with some weathered wood, a DIY paint, to make it even darker. You may have noticed there on the side that my little trusty companion is right there with me. He decided just to lay down and take a nap while I did my work. I put the paint out on a piece of cellophane. I use the cellophane that my decoupage papers come in, the ones that my stamps and my transfers come in. They're great because once you're done with it, you can just wad it up and throw it away. I really like the extra dimension and darkness that this paint was giving to the wood. And I knew that the leaves were going to show up much better on this dark background. I left the center untouched because I knew that's where the decoupage paper was going. This is the decoupage paper that I picked out. It is from Decoupage Queen. I believe it is size A3, which is the larger one. And I like to use the water method to get the edges off. So I just go along the edge with a paintbrush dipped in water, wait a second or two, and then that white edge easily pulls away, and it gives you a much nicer, much more organic edge than if you were to take the scissors out and cut it off. Once I was finished with the decoupage paper, I turned it over and I put a coat of white paint on the back. I thought that that would be much easier than trying to paint the center of the board because I run the risk of getting white on the outside of where the decoupage paper went, or not getting the section large enough and having a shadow around the edge of the decoupage paper, which I didn't want. After the paint had dried, I went back to my board and I decoupaged the paper on as I would any other. I always lay down a starter strip of decoupage medium, and I generally spritz my decoupage paper. However, in this instance I didn't because it did have that paint on the back, but I always go over the top with the decoupage medium as well, and in this case I used a brayer to help get rid of any wrinkles in the paper. I continued with this process until I had the entire sheet of decoupage paper down. Once I had the decoupage paper down, I turned my attention to the leaves. I started out by using just the decoupage medium I had used on the paper, but decided it might not be strong enough because the leaves were starting to curl on the edges. So I mixed together some of my quick and thick Type Bond glue with water and use that as the medium to get the leaves to lay down. I used my trusty cellophane again, put it on top, and then weighed them down with books. And then when I took it off, those were securely in place. I decided to add a couple more leaves. I really liked this one that had some green in it. And so I just worked my way a little bit further up the board. And then once I had them in place, I got out the cellophane again to cover them up and put some bottles on it to weigh them down until they dried. I had a few small leaves left inside the paper towel, and so I decided I would put them at the top in the opposite corner to add a little balance to the piece. After all the leaves were down and had dried, for our last step, I took out the word autumn from one of the new IOD transfer booklets, and I transferred the word onto the bottom of the picture. You'll have to let me know what you think. I'm pretty happy with the way it turned out. And those leaves will always remind me of my morning walks with the puppy. Project 2, I took this wooden planter I had thrifted from Goodwill and decided I was going to upcycle it for fall. I got out one of my favorite fall colors. This is DIY's Queen Bee, and painted the entire thing with 2 coats. After the paint had dried, I got out my finger sander and began to distress along the edges of the wood. DIY paint is very easy to distress either with a wet cloth or with sandpaper because it's clay-based. It does not have a built-in primer or a top coat, but that's also why you always have to seal your DIY paint when you're done using it on a project. After I was done distressing it, I then used a top coat to seal in the paint. I was going to add some transfers to it and also do a little more distressing using Fusion's Antiquing Glaze and DIY's Decrepit Dust. When you use the Antiquing Glaze, you can leave it on the entire piece if you want to. I tend to brush it on rather heavily and then go back with a cloth and wipe a lot of it back. Because I'm always going for an old vintage look and items tend to get darker around the edges or where people might handle them than they do in the center areas. So here I'm wiping back a lot of the glaze in the middle, but as you can see, I'm leaving quite a bit of it around the edges. Before the Antiquing Glaze has a chance to dry completely, I get out my DIY Decrepit Dust and start going along the edges and the corners. If you don't have something like a glaze or a wax on the surface, then the dust just falls off. So you need something for it to stick to. Most of the time I'm using a wax, but in this case I was using the glaze and it worked just fine. continued to add decrepit dust until I achieved the look that I was going for. And then I got out my transfers. I had picked the transfers out ahead of time, making sure that they were going to fit on the front of the planter, and I wanted ones that had a very fall look to them. These particular transfers are from one of the new IOD holiday releases. The book is called Santa's Hollow, and even though it sounds like it would be all about Christmas, there are several fall-inspired transfers in this book, as well as a couple others. And then, of course, there's the transfer book Clementine that everybody loves, and I believe that the transfers in it could be used the year round. A couple of things I'll note about putting on transfers. First of all, I believe they go on a lot easier if you have a top coat that you're putting them onto. And then with these that have a lot of very delicate parts, it's just a matter of being patient as you move along. Otherwise, they're very, very easy to put on. You can see this one I cut because the top of the planter sticks out a little bit. So I'm going to put part of it below the rim and the rest of it along the rim. And I do that on both sides. After looking at the finished product, I decided it needed a butterfly. So I found a butterfly from one of the transfers and added it as well. All transfers have to be sealed with either a wax or a top coat, so as a final step, I sealed mine in with the top coat. I really love the way this planter turned out. It has me so excited for fall and the beginning of the holidays. I think this would be beautiful as a centerpiece on a Thanksgiving table, filled with an array of beautiful fall foliage. Let me know what you think in the comments. For projects 3 and 4, I'm switching from fall into Halloween mold. I don't know what I was thinking there, but I definitely meant to say Halloween mode. Anyway, I picked up this little shelf sitter at Goodwill for a couple of bucks and decided that I was going to make a Halloween shelf sitter. Worked out perfect because it was already black around the edges, which is exactly what I wanted, and it already had a little bit of distressing. So with something like this, you can do a very easy thrift flip. I started out by painting the surface solid white because I had decided I was going to put a decoupage paper on it. And generally you want a light background behind your decoupage paper so that the colors and images in the paper will pop. Once the paint had dried, I got out my decoupage paper and I laid it on top and positioned it to figure out where I wanted to cut it. Obviously the paper is a lot larger than the block, and I wanted to get as many of the elements in it as I could. For example, a black cat, the number 31, the word boo, some pumpkins, and so forth. And once I made the decision, I cut it down to size and then got out my decoupage medium, and this time I'm using DIY's liquid patina and decoupage the paper onto the wood. Once the paper was dry, I used my finger sander to remove all of the excess paper from around the edges. After I was finished with that, I got out Big Top and my DIY Decrepit Dust and started going around the edges. I added a little bit of the Decrepit Dust on top of the black paint just to give it a little more dimension and to bring in some of the brown tones from the decoupage paper. I also used the Big Top and DIY's Decrepit Dust to go around the edges of the decoupage paper and give it a little more of a dark, moody feel, which has always been my favorite take on Halloween, and you will definitely see that in the next project. I didn't get this last part filmed, but for a little added whimsy, I got a pumpkin-shaped drawer pull and put it on the top with a little ribbon. You're going to see how much different my two Halloween items are, and you'll have to let me know which was your favorite. For project 4, I started out with one of the arched panels from IOD. I painted the inside of the arch white because I had a piece of decoupage paper I wanted to put in there. After I was finished painting the panel, I took out some 2-ply paper towel. I separated the two parts of the paper towel and then wrinkled them in my hand. I then stretched it out and started to lay it along the outer frame of my panel. I'm using a mixture of glue and water to put it down, keeping the wrinkles intact as I move along. I did this last year when making a book for Halloween, and it turned out amazing. The book looked as if it had been wrapped in bandages. I continued this process, adding pieces of paper towel as needed until I had made my way around the entire frame. After I'd finished with the outside frame, I then proceeded with that same process to put the paper towel on the inside ledge or part of the frame. Once the paper towel had dried completely, I got out Fusion Mineral Paint in the color Coal Black, and I used it to paint the entire outside frame. I also used the Coal Black to go around the edge of the panel. For the inside of the frame, I used the DIY color Prairie Gray. I wanted to match some of the tones in the decoupage paper, and I also wanted to have this for this to have a very dark, moody feel to it. Apparently, I've been talking too long already. After the paint had dried, I then started the process of decoupaging my decoupage paper onto the inner panel. I laid down some decoupage varnish and glue. This is Pentart brand. And then I sprayed the back of my paper and laid it down in the center. I love the ghostly figure coming out of the woods. Reminds me of all the things I thought about when I was a kid. And I would walk down the streets of my small hometown at night, and you would hear the leaves rustling. And sometimes I could actually scare myself into running home because for whatever reason, I would always imagine there was someone walking behind me. And as I heard the leaves rustling, my heart would race, and the next thing I knew, I was on a dead run to my house. That might sound a little strange to you, but then my husband tells me all the time I'm not quite normal. But you have to keep in mind that in the fall and winter, it gets dark very early. So I was probably on my way home from a friend's house or the library. To finish this project up, I took a frame that I had poured when I was using some clear resin and decoupaged the number 31 to the back of it. I found that from a scrap of decoupage paper, so as I've said in other videos, I never throw anything away because you never know when you can use it. After I decoupaged it on, I painted the frame in black. Then I went back to my panel, and on the original decoupage paper there were dark tree branches hanging down from the forest, but I had to cut that part off in order to make the decoupage paper fit into the frame like I wanted it to. So I took out a small artist brush and used some of that coal black paint to paint in the missing branches. And then I dry brushed the outer frame with some of the prairie gray to bring out details. You can probably tell that this is my favorite of the two Halloween projects. I love anything that's dark and moody and a little bit scary. The dried rosemary is said to dispel evil spirits and offer protection, perfect for this scene. For Project 5, I chose this galvanized bucket that I picked up recently in a thrift store. It had a texture to it which I really hadn't noticed on any of the other galvanized pieces I've purchased. So I decided not to prime it. I went straight in with Fusion Mineral Paint in Fort York Red, a beautiful red for Christmas. And remember that Fusion Mineral Paint does have a built-in primer and sealer. So I think this paint job will last a very, very long time. After the paint had dried, I went to my IOD transfer books and picked out some transfers that I thought would look nice on this. I love this old-time Santa standing there by the tree with his sack. So I decided I was going to put him on the front. Again, when you are working with transfers, it's good to have a sealer down. So if you're using something like clay paint, you have to seal it first, or you should. I've heard that it works either way, but I know for me it works a lot better with the sealer down. But with the Fusion Mineral Paint, because it has the built-in sealer, I didn't feel the need to seal the bucket before I put the transfer on. When you put on the transfers, just take your time. And if any of the transfer comes up, lay the sheet back down and rub over it again. And then make sure you burnish it in with either your fingers or the vellum sheet. I decided to add some holly and berry garland to the top to make it even more festive. I wanted to add a little something to the back so that you could face it either way, and so I chose this deer standing out in the trees. I thought it matched the Santa standing next to the pine tree. They both have sort of a in the forest look to them. I also added some oak leaves and acorns to the top and bottom of the backside. I think it gives it a very fall look, so it could be used for fall foliage, even though it is painted bright red. I know I've mentioned this before, but it is important that you always seal your transfers with either a top coat or wax. In this case, I'm using Big Top by DIY. Even though I had sealed it with a top coat, once it was dry, I did go over it with a coat of clear wax. And my primary reason for doing this was I wanted to do some distressing around all of the ridges and the handles on the top of the bucket using DIY's Decrepit Dust. And you have to have something down that will hold the dust. So in this case, I used clear wax. As you can see here, I'm going around the bottom, along the seam on the side, around the handles where they attach to the bucket, along the ridge at the top. Any place that you might think dirt would gather, or any place where you think someone might pick it up with their hands. I also took a little bit of the Decrepit Dust and rubbed it over the entire surface, buffing it back with a paper towel. I wanted to add a little bit of grunge, but not so much that it took away from that beautiful red paint. While I first thought of this as a vase, something to hold florals, I decided I liked it better as a utensil holder for the kitchen. It's sturdy enough that you can put in several wooden spoons as well as a very big rolling pin. You'll have to let me know in the comments what you would use it for. For Project 6, I picked up this small cutting board at a local thrift shop. I gave it a good sanding on one side and then wiped off all of the sanding dust. I had decided that I wanted to put a paint inlay on it. So after I cleaned it, I gave it a coat of DIY in the color crinoline. I generally prefer to use an off-white color versus white because I like my projects to look vintage, and crinoline just has a beautiful creamy color without being too yellow. Once the first coat of paint had dried, I went in with a second coat of crinoline. This time I used a little more paint because you need wet paint to lay your inlay into, and you want to make sure there's enough that the entire inlay will transfer. You do have a little time to work with the inlay to get it where you want it, but you can see here that this paint almost began to transfer immediately. However, in the end, you couldn't tell that I had moved it. Once I had it down and had pressed it in with my fingers a little bit, I sprayed it with some water and then gave it a light rollover with my IOD brayer, trying to ensure that all those little details were embedded down into the paint. I let the inlay set for several hours until it was completely dry. Then I sprayed it with some more water, let it set for about 30 seconds, and then dabbed the excess water off before removing the inlay. I'm always amazed when I take an inlay off. This one came out perfect, right down to the tiniest bit of lettering. It's absolutely beautiful. Some people would have stopped right here and sealed in the paint, but of course, if you've watched any of my videos, you know that I love things to look distressed and old. It doesn't mean that everything necessarily has to be grungy, but I do want it to look like it's been around a while versus something that I just walked into a store and purchased. I really love the way you can use the IOD products and other products, items that you've thrifted, and make one-of-a-kind home decor that no one else is going to have. I continue sanding this all the way around the edges, and then I even go in and sand the actual inlay itself, because again, if it's going to look old, that paint that's on there would not be in pristine condition. Whenever you're using a paint inlay, you have to keep in mind that that is actual paint. It's not something that's permanent like ink, and it can be reactivated with water. So you need to seal in that paint. Here I'm choosing to use a very light coat of Big Top, hardly pressing down on the brush at all. However, if you are worried about smearing the paint, you can always take it outside and spray it with a clear matte top coat. I often use Rust-Oleum to do this. In the beginning, I hadn't really decided what I wanted to do with the breadboard, but I did know that I didn't want it to be just something that you would sit on your countertop or hang on the wall, because it is fairly small in size. I went through my stash and I found this beautiful frame, and I thought the frame matched the artwork on the inlay very well. And so I took the backing off the frame and the matting with the original artwork in it, and I decoupaged a piece of green plaid paper over the top of it. This particular decoupage paper happens to be from Decoupage Queen. Once the paper had thoroughly dried, I applied a heavy coat of Titebond Thick and Quick glue to the back of my board, and then I centered the board on my paper. The last thing I needed to do was to add the frame. I absolutely love how this turned out. I did do a little distressing around the edges to give it that old-timey country feel. This is exactly the type of artwork I would hang in my home during the holidays. You'll have to let me know what you think of it. If you're still here, thank you so much for sticking around. I hope you enjoyed the project as much as I enjoyed making them. And again, if you haven't done so already, please consider subscribing to my channel and giving me a thumbs up. It means so much to me that you would take time out of your busy day to watch my video. Thanks again for tuning in, and have a wonderful week.